We're in part 3 of our introduction to Netlify, and this is Netlify Dev. Netlify Dev is the newest kid on the block, and in fact, most of it is still in beta, but it's worth talking about because it's kind of the newest functionality, and it helps a lot with your local dev capabilities. So the best way to find out more information about it is to check out the site, netlify.com/product/dev, and this gives you a good overview about what it does. It's a dev server that powers a lot of the local replication of what the Netlify production platform is, and we just replicate it on your local environment. And the reason you want this is because, remember, you want to have faster iteration cycles and you don't want to wait for the build bot. So you want to have full control and local replication of your builds before you actually deploy them. So the way you get there is to npm install the CLI and then run netlify dev. And this has the detector mode that will pick up any of your static site generator projects. So that starts a full local environment. It detects and runs your site generator, makes environment variables available from the production platform, does edge logic so your redirects will work, and then runs your cloud functions as a local server. And we proxy everything together. And then you can also stream live as well. So the best way to get started is also to head to the docs. There's a talk that you should definitely check out introducing Netlify Dev. This talk happens to be the keynote at which Netlify Dev was launched, so definitely check that out. And the other thing you should know about the docs is that it's not the full story. The Netlify Dev API is still a little bit in flux, and so we've actually managed that on the CLI repo. And you have to just go to the GitHub netlify-/CLI, and you just look in the README and look for the Netlify Dev docs. And here you can get actually detailed information about usage. But we're going to guide you through it. So let's head over to our demo site that we've been working on. And this is running Parcel, and it's a project that we can run. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to treat this as a static site. So I'm going to act as the build bot. And what does the build bot do for building this site? It doesn't run the dev server, it actually runs the build command, right? So let's actually just run the build command ourselves. I'm gonna run yarn build, and that actually runs parcel build, and that generates to the dist folder you can see over here. And so that's normally what we'd serve from Netlify's point of view. And so now we can actually run netlify dev. So we have that CLI command, netlify dev. There's that little gem icon that I'm very proud of. And you can see that there's no dev server detected. It's spun up a server on localhost 3999 as well as a Netlify dev server on localhost 8888. So they're two different servers, and let's see what the difference is. So now I'm on localhost 8888, and you can see that I have an active React app. It looks good, and that's what we've been working with. But also I can go to localhost 3999 and get the exact same thing. So I also have a live React app. And so what's the difference? Why do we have two different servers? And that's what you really have to understand about Netlify, is that there's a project server and then there's a Netlify dev server. So the project server is, if it comes with a server, then we'll use that one. If not, Netlify dev will spin up a server for you and then serve from there. So that's what we've been doing just now, which we serve up a static host. And it will join everything and then output a single unified location, so localhost 8888. So that about sums it up for the build process. But we also want to preserve the developer experience of the live hot reloading dev server. So let's take a look at what Parcel does for hot reloading. We run yarn start, and it runs parcel source index HTML, and then it outputs at localhost 1234. So that's the important port for them. For Parcel, it's going to be 1234. For other projects that create React app, it will be others. But we know that for Netlify Dev, so we can go into netlify.toml and add that config command. So the port will be 1234. And we can tell Netlify Dev that. And you can see documentation for this in the Netlify Dev docs over there. And that's exactly what we're doing. And then we'll add the command of yarn start. That's exactly what we just did, right? We ran yarn start, and then we navigated to localhost 1234. So we've configured Netlify Dev inside of netlify.toml. And the final piece is that we'll want to add a publish directory. This is really where the redirects file will be located. It's not strictly necessary, but it's probably a good idea to leave it in there. I'm just going to point it to source. doesn't really matter. So now I can run Netlify Dev, and instead of running a static server for me, it's going to actually start to run the parcel server for me on localhost 1234. I'm making an emphasis on this because previously we ran a static server and we just did yarn build before running our static server and then serving up our files locally. Now we're using Netlify Dev to run parcel start or yarn start, which runs parcel, and parcel runs a server at localhost 1234. So again, you'll see that the site can be accessed on localhost 1234, and also the Netlify Dev server can be accessed at localhost 8888. So the question then becomes, why bother to have two servers? It's confusing. It seems like it's unnecessary. We have localhost on 8888 as well as 1234. And the reason is because of this diagram. And this is all the extra functionality we get to add because we're proxying the project's original server to 8888. And so when we're the user, we actually view that URL, localhost 888, and we get all this functionality that we would get in production. For example, redirects. So over here in my underscore redirects file, I have a redirect from about us to about. And so when I head to localhost 8888, I can type in about us, and that redirects to /about, and that means that our redirects are working locally. And that's important for people, for example, in the advertising industry who really care a lot about broken links. I also want to show you how detectors work. So notice I'm starting from an empty folder, and I'm going to create a new Create React app. That's always very awkward to say. And now when I'm done installing, notice how this is a normal Create React app folder. And normally you'd start by typing yarn start, and that kicks off the React script's start script. But here, we're actually going to just run Netlify Dev, and Netlify Dev is going to pick it up, the fact that we're running a Create React app project, and then it'll just run automatically and pick it up. So that's the vision of Create React app and detectors and Netlify, that Netlify Dev will just detect your project and it will just run the server automatically without any configuration. Now we're going to do a quick demo of how environment variables work in Netlify Dev, and you can pull down your production environment variables to local dev. Obviously, you shouldn't always do that, but it can be very helpful for debugging and not duplicating some environment variables. So first I'm going to run a yarn build. And because I don't have this new project linked up to Netlify, I'm going to run netlify init. And because I don't have it linked to GitHub, I'm just going to choose the create deploy site manually option. And it's just going to create a site instance for me that I can deploy to. So now I'm just going to create a netlify.toml file. And that's going to house all the settings which I normally would set up. So first I'll add in a build key with a publish value of build. And the other command I'm going to run is just netlify deploy --prod. And so now, because I'm just going to publish that build folder, that's all I need to know. And now I'm deployed. My Create React app is deployed without continuous deployment. But now I can run something like netlify open and head to the deploy section and head to the environment variable section and add in an environment variable. Here I'm using everybody's favorite environment variable, my_secret, but that's actually not going to work in a React app because Create React app doesn't want you to expose every environment variable on the front end. So they have this filtered. You must prefix all your environment variables with React app _ and then whatever your environment variable is. So those are the ones that will actually get exposed on the front end. And that's a very good security feature, but it just trips up people who don't know that it exists and they have to look in the docs. So now we can actually reference that environment variable inside of our code. So here I'm just going to access process.env.react app my secret. And that's going to be available in production. So typically what you do here is you try to have a duplicate .env file locally and then run that. But here when I run netlify dev, I just run nd because of my shortcut. I can just run the dev server, but then also if you look at the build logs, it also injects this build setting of environment variables. So netlify dev goes up into my netlify instance, pulls down that secret, and now locally, I haven't deployed yet. Locally, I have access to that production environment variable. So that's the idea, and that can be extended to do a lot of different things, to get, for example, integrations with add-on providers. I'm going to do a video on that as well. But just trivially, you can replicate your production environment with environment variables and redirects. You can also share them live with Netlify dash live, but that's very beta, so I'm not going to show it to you today. And the other thing that we're going to talk about is also not exposing your secret. So here I have a secret that I want to work with, but I don't want to expose it to the front end, but I still have to work with it in some form. So for example, like an API secret that I want to hide somewhere, right? Like I don't want the user to know it because then they can also just use my functions. So I'm going to show you the Netlify functions create command. You can type it out as part of the CLI. So obviously, we're just going to use Netlify functions :create. But obviously, you can also use a alias for that. I use NFC, and that just runs that command. I don't have a functions folder, so I'm just going to go ahead and go to netlify.toml and add a functions folder. You can call it the very creative name of functions, but you can just really call it whatever you like. And now I'm going to run Netlify functions create again, and notice it created that functions folder. And now it gives me this drop down of things I can choose from. So there's a whole bunch of pre-made templates for you to get started, depending on your use case. Here we're really just going to go through and maybe pick something like this hello world function that I've picked out. And that really scaffolds out that template into your functions folder that you've configured. By default, Netlify Dev gives you a folder and then a script under that folder, which is named the same, and it follows the AWS Lambda syntax. And so now I can rename my secret to just my secret because I'm not going to expose it to the front end. And I can take that my underscore secret and expose and grab it in process.env inside of my Netlify function. So here I have it co-located with my source code, but I'm just going to say process.env.mySecret, and I'm just going to echo it out in a JSON body response. So now I'm going to run Netlify Dev, and that, again, thinking about your mental model, runs that create React app server, but then also runs a Netlify function server. So it's under the URL .netlify/function/hello-world. And now that response, hello, I'm always angry, that's the exact response from the environment variables. So we've now shown you how to access environment variables from the front end as well as via functions. And that's very helpful. So for example, when I create a hook or I fetch data when I load my app, and when I load my app, I can just head back to the front end. That's going to ping my function. And let me just open up the DevTools over here. So I'm going to open my app, and it's going to ping my function. And so it's not going to expose that environment variable on the front end. It's going to just ping that Netlify function, and the function itself has access to that environment variable. Now, obviously, this is a very simple function. And if you look at the code, it's actually, we've erred on the side of very simplicity, just to show you that you really don't need that much to get going. We've even included some boilerplate like catching and returning a status code of 500 if there's an error, and that's just a best practice for HTTP status codes. But here we're going to introduce a more complicated function, and this time one that uses node modules dependency for itself. So again, we're going to run Netlify functions create. I'm going to pick the node fetch template, and node fetch itself installs node modules with a package JSON, and then it uses that as a fetch inside of node to ping an API. So this is a more realistic Netlify function or serverless function, which proxies an API for you. So here I'm going to ping the node fetch in my front end, and then run Netlify Dev. And now when I reload my front end, it actually loads that external API. And so now it's proxied so that I can bypass CORS issues, for example, or I can add a secret API key, or I can add several functions, or I can read a database, and really just whatever you want to do in Node, you can do in a Node.js functions subject to the timeout limits. So here, for example, I can add my process.env.mySecret, and if that was required by the API, I could definitely send it in there without exposing it to my front end. So that is probably the #1 support question, and now you know how to do that. I can also swap it out. So for example, here I have a different API, and I'm swapping it out for Chuck Norris jokes. Always a good time. But hopefully you get the idea that I'm developing all this very, very quickly inside of my local dev environment. and it's exactly the same environment as it would be in a serverless scenario. I can even test it. For example, if I open up a new terminal and type netlify functions invoke, that will give me a list of my existing functions, and I can pick that one of the functions like hello world. I can choose whether I want to emulate netlify identity. We'll talk about this in another video. I'm going to go with no for now. And that would basically pass a authentication header if I need to. But here we get the mock response. So without even running a front end, I can test my Netlify function. And so that's a very good example. For more information, definitely read the README, for example, for passing a sample payload, query string, as well as a file that has that payload. We do have special case event-triggered functions. We're not really going to cover that right now, but event-triggered functions are basically hard-coded names that are triggered on certain events, like, for example, when someone signs in through Netlify identity, and that's useful to know. Now, an important thing to know is to understand what happens when I have my Netlify functions continuously deployed. So, for example, here in my gitignore folder file, I have the node modules gitignored. So that means that when I deploy my files in Netlify's buildbot, the node modules for the node fetch function will not be there. And that will be a problem because it will try to require the node fetch module and it will fail. So here I have an example of such a failure, and it says, for example, error could not find node fetch module in the file. And so a lot of people run into this and think it's a bug with Netlify Dev. It's not really. It's also a little bit our fault that we can make this experience a bit nicer. But really, the solution is to make sure to install, to run npm install or yarn on each individual function folder if you need it. Obviously, if you don't need it, you can just put everything in the top level node modules, and that's the standard node resolution algorithm. But one solution to actually use is to add netlify-lambda. So this is a helper library. It used to be the predecessor to Netlify Dev, and that's why you see some old information about this. But now netlify-lambda is a helper library for Netlify Dev, and we'll use the netlify-lambda install thing, and we'll just add it as a post-install npm script. So now that will run, and it'll go through every single function folder, and it will just install the dependencies for every functions folder. And you can read more in the docs, but essentially this is what the success will look like. We can see somewhere in the docs that we'll have a netlify-lambda install command being run, and it will say it's installing function dependencies and node fetch dependencies are installed. So that's the kind of thing that we are looking for a continuously deployed serverless Netlify function solution with node dependencies, all independently managed per folder. And that's a really good way to handle the dependencies because it will just guarantee that it's always installed. And so here you can see the same app that we built in Dev in production, and it was working exactly the same. Now, if you notice, all of these functions that we've been written so far is in Node.js format with the exports.handler syntax or module.export syntax. And if you want to use Webpack, Babel, or TypeScript, you can't really do that here without a build step, right? This is raw Node.js. It runs under Node 8 or 10, and you really need a build step, and that's where you use Netlify-lambda. So Netlify-lambda and Netlify Dev have similar but overlapping responsibilities, and I wrote a lot of docs in the README to explain how to use them. But basically, Netlify-lambda is a build tool now that runs your Netlify functions from a source to a dist. And that's the basic understanding that you have to achieve here. Now these functions will be your source file, and you're going to have to serve or publish the functions from a dist folder. So here we can actually move everything. So for example, I can create a new function folder called source/functions, and I can move this function, this hello world function, to a TypeScript function. I can also just like rename everything. So I'm gonna add some TypeScript types. So for example, I can follow the docs and add Babel preset TypeScript, yarn add -d Babel preset TypeScript, and I can also add a bunch of other utilities like TypeScript, types node, and types AWS Lambda. And that just helps to add TypeScript to my project. Here I'm only going to use it for that hello world function, but you can see everything I'm about to do. So I'm adding a Babel RC file, and so we're using TypeScript with Babel. And now in hello-world.ts, I can import the types for importing the handler context callback and API gateway type from AWS Lambda. So now I can go through and type everything, and I can also use the export keyword. And that's a very, very handy way of typing everything. So now I can type, for example, API gateway events for events and context for context. And now each of these things have the correct properties on them. So for example, if I type event dot, it gives me all those values from the autocomplete because of the types that are just from definitely typed of AWS Lambda. Same thing for context, including an identity field, which we can use for Netlify identity. And so these are just very handy ways of writing better, more correct code if you are okay with using a build step and using TypeScript. And so now we need to impose a build command. I'm going to put it on the post build part of npm scripts. It's going to run netlify lambda build source functions. So it's going to build from the source functions into the production, publish the folder that we're going to publish, like functions hello world. And that's going to be hello world.js, right? And that's going to be a minified output from the source TypeScript file. And so that's what Netlify Lambda does. It helps you install dependencies, and it helps you build from a source file to a dist file. And so then everything can be run locally. Netlify Dev has an understanding of what Netlify Lambda is, so it will run Netlify Lambda build for you if it detects it in your package scripts. So this is what we call function builder detectors, and that's exactly how it's supposed to work, so that you can run it locally and make sure that your scripts are up to date, but then also deploy them with minimum configuration. So that is Netlify Dev. We're going to go to the next part to identity, forms, analytics, CMS, all that good stuff. But thank you for taking the time to check out Netlify Dev, and hopefully that helps your local dev work.